In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up Firebase in your React and React Native projects, and I'm not only going to show you how to do it, but I'm going to explain exactly why we're doing it in this particular way, and I'm also going to touch on a few other examples of ways you might see that you may not want to actually mess with right now. So here I have a code sandbox with a basic React router with authentication setup. This is the actual Firebase config. So this is really what you'll find in most examples. There's some file that is importing Firebase, the actual Firebase library. You have the specific feature of Firebase that you want to include in your project. So here we have the main Firebase app import, the Firebase auth import, and then you're going to be given this config object when you set up your project in the Firebase console. So I am not going to show you my API keys here, but assume this is a bunch of stuff I copy pasted from the Firebase console when I created this app. In this particular case, we are just going to initialize our app with this config that we got from the Firebase console, and we will export the Firebase app. Keep in mind that because we have imported Firebase auth here, this Firebase app will have that particular feature enabled once it is exported from this file. Now, one thing you may see done here is that the someone will have a line such as this. I'm going to copy paste this in just so you guys can see it. So you may see it done this way, where we are checking if a Firebase app has already been initialized, and if it is not, we go ahead and do the standard initialization with the config and export that. If it already has been initialized, we would export the Firebase app. This is okay, but it is also not necessary. In ES6 or modern JavaScript development environments, this file will only ever be executed once. It is automatically a singleton, so you don't need to check if there is already a Firebase app initialized. The only way that this the only way that you could run into problems not checking is in your dev environment. As you can see, if you make changes to this particular file, say we change this to app2 or something. So now you see we're getting an error here that the Firebase app already exists, but that's only something that happens in the dev environment and only when you're editing this file. And the solution is actually just to refresh, because it just means your environment is just a little confused about what you've done here. It's trying to do fancy hot reloading and things in the background that never would happen in a real application. So you can just refresh your app in that case. Things will be back to normal. So one other thing you may see done here is an actual class being created, an actual Singleton class here. Let me see if I can pull up an example of that to show real quick. So I will copy this in here. So you might see something like this, where we're creating a class, and then in the constructor of the class, we're going to initialize the Firebase. So this would actually be, in our case, Firebase. And then you would export this class. And then from there, actually, you may even see, let's see, where you would add methods onto this class. And there's a very popular post out that you may have come across. I'll link it in the description, where you'll see things like this. So basically, we're taking our Firebase, we are creating this class, we're initializing Firebase inside of that class, and then we're basically just wrapping the Firebase methods with our own names and exporting this class instead of Firebase itself. I do not like this method because, first of all, this is not OOP. This is React. This is mostly functional programming. Creating random classes for things, is not really the best option in most cases. Also, it seems completely unnecessary to me because not only are you creating this class structure that isn't really needed since Firebase already has these methods attached to it, the global Firebase reference, but you're also making your project a little more confusing because now I'll be accessing things like Firebase.do create this thing, which when you're looking elsewhere in your code base, it's not going to make any sense. So when you're looking at documentation and things like that and how to use Firebase in general, even in more advanced topics, it's going to be kind of hard to it's giving you an extra layer of cognitive overload here, where you have to try to figure out, did I wrap this correctly? Did I pass the same arguments? Am I returning what it should return? It's just adding too much more to think about, and it's just not necessary. You can just directly initialize the app and export it, and then throughout your application, it will exactly match whatever Firebase documentation you might be looking at, and you don't have to write so much extra boilerplate code. Okay, so let's continue from here to see how we would actually start integrating Firebase into our app. So we'll start in app.js or whatever your top level file is. It doesn't really matter. In this case, we want to import Firebase here. And that would be from /Firebase config or whatever you've named it. It really does not matter. Looks like we need to refresh our app. And so we just have an app, and based on the value of this user state, we are either rendering authenticated routes or unauthenticated routes. And this is a setup that you may want to review to our previous video on setting this all up, authentication with React Router, using a technique that I learned from Kent C. Dodd's, a post he did. And that's where this is coming from. So feel free to go ahead and refer back to that video, which I will try to put somewhere, I don't know. And that will show you how to build this. But for now, it doesn't matter. This is just the basics. If I have a user, render authenticated stuff. If I don't have a user, render like the login. So we have a basic homepage with a login here. I'll show you guys that real quick. It's just a basic form. On submit, we hit Firebase. So let's see what happens. Firebase is already imported into this home component. All this already is set up to sign in. So if I have a valid user, and actually it may you may want to notice here that once we successfully sign in, it's going to log the result, which should be the user information from Firebase. If not, it'll console.log an error. So I've already created a user in the Firebase console with an extremely secure password of 123456, and I'm going to log in. And as you can see, we are successfully logged in. We have received a success response with that Firebase user information in the console, which you can't see because of my big old head. There it is. And from there, we'll notice that we're still not actually logged in our React application because we have not attached Firebase into our app state, which we need to do here. So we've got Firebase pulled into app.js, and the most basic way to go ahead and integrate this authentication, we'll just create a use effect, which calls Firebase.auth. Sometimes I will call this Firebase app or something like that, just so that I know that this is the initialized app. And it keeps things a little more clear for me. So we'll change that up. We need to call Firebase app.auth.on auth state changed. And this takes a callback function, which receives the logged in user. And then we can go ahead and just call set user to user. All right, let's save that. We'll refresh here. Okay, so now you can see that automatically, since Firebase manages the auth state by itself, it deals with all the browser stuff as far as cookies and whatever. I don't know the details. I just know that we're automatically already logged in our app because once we called Firebase again, it could see that we already were logged in. So you'll see now we have access to the dashboard and our profile page with a logout button, which lets us know we're logged in. quick note on this, which has nothing to do with Firebase itself, but since we have this callback function that takes a user and all it does is set a user with that same variable, we can actually shorten this whole thing to just pass the set user reference directly. And that will still accomplish the exact same thing. Also, we are making a huge mistake here with our use effect by not putting any dependencies. So let's fix that. And we're just adding an empty dependency array because we really don't have a reason for this to ever want to run again. It is our top level app component anyway, so if it remounts, something has gone horribly wrong. So now we have basic authentication. We can log out here, which will take us back to the main flow of the application, where we can access Jack. This is a whole different set of routes. And then we can log back in, which will give us the authenticated version of our app, which includes completely different routes. A couple notes on doing things this way. We're importing the Firebase instance wherever we need to use Firebase, which could become a problem once our app starts to grow. To start off, this is probably fine, especially for something like Auth, which you're only going to be doing in a limited number of places, especially with this particular setup where if we are authenticated, then we just are rendering a specific set of routes and components that assume the user is authenticated. And you wouldn't really have to worry about or check the Firebase authentication. But this will become a problem if we start having components where we need to know who the user is. Maybe we want to, on this profile page, for example, show the username. Let's open that up. So now we'd have to bring in the Firebase app here, which we already have it for the logout. So everywhere we want Firebase, we would have to import that Firebase config and then use the methods on that app in that component. So that means all of your components start to be tied to this Firebase app import. There's not really a clean way with this method to kind of abstract that away or control things in a central location. But again, for a smaller app, this might be fine, especially if we're talking just about authentication. Another issue with this approach, though, is every component that needs to use Firebase has to know about Firebase, if that makes sense. It's just too coupled. Another issue is that, say this was a large project at a company, that means that all the devs working on that project have to know about Firebase. They'd have to know, what all the methods are and, what specific Firebase specific features they need to access to accomplish certain things, when in actuality, we might want to add a small layer of abstraction in some cases. And we wouldn't be able to do that in this case if we're just grabbing the Firebase reference everywhere. The other issue here is, let's say we don't like Firebase. Let's say we wanted to change our authentication to Auth 0 or AWS or something else. Now we have to dig all through our app and find all references of Firebase app and pull it out. And I know this is a video about how to set up Firebase properly, but it also shows us how to set up any service that it needs to have global ties into your app that you may or may not want to have to import in every component. So we want to make it easy to use Firebase throughout our app without importing it everywhere. To give us an idea of where this becomes a problem, let's go back into our Firebase config and we will bring in Firebase Firestore, which is the basic Firebase database, or the recommended. And let's bring that over into our app.js. So we already are set up to log in, but now we want to fetch some data once the user is logged in. And the way I would want to do that is we'll add another use effect. And this use effect will depend on if the user has changed. Now, if there is not a user, just don't do anything. The point of this effect is to load data based on that user, some metadata. So if there isn't one, let's not do anything. And I'm going to bring in some code. All we're doing is getting a reference to the user's collection in Firebase. And we're grabbing the specific document that matches the user ID for that Firebase user. So whatever's in that document, we're going to pull that in here, and we're just going to log it for now. If there is no such document, maybe this person has never logged in, we never added any metadata for that user, then there won't be a document. Usually you throw this into state or something like that. So let's refresh, and you'll see now in our console, we have our document data, which was pulled from Firestore. Let's say that now we want to access that data in our profile. An app may have a dashboard that has a profile. We want to show the profile data here. Now we're running into the issue of, well, that data is not accessible here. I would have to refetch that data in this component. So we're getting into an issue of having some type of global store to be able to pass this Firebase information down the tree. Once the user's logged in, we're probably going to fetch some data about that user, but that data is probably not going to change that often, and we're probably not going to continually be updating this data. The main solution for this, even though I said the word store, which you could use Redux or MobX or something like that, but because we're at such a high level in our app, and because we know that in this particular case, or in the most basic case, the user's information is not going to be changing that much. This isn't going to cause many re-renders. I would opt for using Context API and moving all of this logic into a authentication context. So let's go ahead and see how that looks. So let's see what that looks like. Just like a cooking show where they've already prepared the dish ahead of time just to show you, I already have that context set up. So I'm just going to get rid of that the use effects here. And before we implement it in app, I'll show you what the auth context looks like, which should be similar again from the other video where we set this up. But we just have a basic context. We've imported Firebase here. And then we're setting up our provider component. So that takes in props. We have that user state now living inside of this context, as well as the use effect for the auth state change listener to set the user. And then our context value in this simple case is just the Firebase reference and the user that we get from our provider state. We pass that to the auth context provider, the value, and then whatever props were also passed to that context. And in this case, also we have our nifty helper function, which allows us to use this context hook, or use this context so that we don't have to import use context and this context into every component. We just import this function and get all the stuff we need to get. So using that, we no longer need to import Firebase here. We want to import use auth from our auth context. And now we should be able to do user. Should be able to destructure, user from use auth. Yes, I'm looking at the keyboard to type. Don't tase me, bro. We no longer need any of this app state because now that state is being handled by the context. Refresh. And as you can see, we are still logged in. And we can go to our dashboard, our profile, we can log out. And let's see, we can also modify the home component. So instead of importing Firebase app here, we could grab Firebase from use auth. We'll need to import that. Okay, so now we have our Firebase reference coming from context instead of importing it into the component. Now, everything should work. Let's test that before we move on here. Let's do a refresh. All right, so we can't access anything. We log in. All right, stop it. We're logged in. We're here. We can log out. We've received the credentials. We're good to go. So pretty much that is the general idea of how you'd want to set this up. Actually, I'm sorry. Let's go ahead and actually pull in the data. So we're missing an entire use effect. I'm just going to copy that back in. So we should have the user be the dependency of our use effect. So now let's go ahead and add this data actually to our state. We'll just have data, set data. It's a horrible name, but whatever. That's what we're doing. So now here, instead of this random console.log, we can set data to doc.data, and we can actually pass that data down in our context. So wherever we need to use this user metadata, we should have access here. All right, so let's try to access that from our profile component here. There we go. All right, so now we have a profile page with a logout button, and we're also pulling in metadata. Now that we have everything set up and we're passing down this Firebase app reference, you could have the option here now of further abstracting the Firebase methods within our auth context value, which may be something you need to do. What you commonly would probably want to do is, instead of exporting the reference of Firebase, you may want to have stuff like sign out, which would be a function that calls Firebase app.signout. And then in that case, you would not export Firebase app. We just want to avoid. So we talked about earlier adding a class into our Firebase config file, which I don't like that approach because I don't think you should be creating classes in React except for specific cases. It's kind of a rare thing. I'm not saying never do it, but usually if you are doing it, you should be very careful. However, in this case with our context, it would make sense that you might want to wrap some of the methods, assuming that maybe down the line you want to replace Firebase, or maybe you have some type of conglomeration of third-party services you're using for auth that you may want to integrate here. I don't know, whatever the case may be, in this context file is where you want to wrap those things. We could also even separate out the data fetching from this auth context and have like a user context, and you would render that underneath the auth context in our app, or actually in our index, where we've actually used the auth provider to wrap our app, which was already here. I'm showing this to you for the first time. You didn't miss anything, but we actually are using the auth provider around our entire app. You could also have a user provider under this, which would depend on this auth provider to fetch that user data or some other metadata that might be related to that user ID. But that is pretty much it. This should give you a basic framework for how you'd want to set up Firebase within your app in the most basic sense, which is just creating the config and importing that reference into all of your files. Assuming it's a relatively small app, that probably would be fine. The next level from there is you'd want to go ahead and create an auth context, which will be the only place you directly use this Firebase import for the config. And then you can either export that reference from here, assuming again that may be the most basic case, which also does allow you to tie in some data and the global user information. Or you could start to pull off methods from that Firebase reference and add those to your auth context. Maybe you want to really get fancy and abstract everything away, and in your actual components, you'd never actually reference Firebase. Maybe here you'd only reference sign in, and then you just take this away here, and maybe you just call sign in. And then we could actually throw that into our auth context. So then this becomes, you have all the flexibility you need to use Firebase throughout your app, as well as sharing data globally from Firebase without getting too fancy. So that's all for today, folks. Hopefully this has been helpful. If you have any questions or if anything was unclear, please feel free to reach out in the comments. Hit me up on Twitter. I'm on the React to Flux Discord as well. And as always, I hope you code something awesome. Peace.